Hey guys, we are back updating the power rankings for Survivor 45 following episode 8. And this was an interesting episode. We obviously got the auction here. We also had a pretty interesting vote out here, though we'll get into that more in a moment. But there are 10 players to talk about, and let's not waste any more time. Let's get right into the video. So starting off at number 10, we have the boot from this week, and here we have Kelly. And Kelly is someone who I was definitely high on to a degree earlier in the season. Though I feel like in recent episodes, I kinda got off the Kelly train. And I feel like this episode had plenty of red flags that indicated that she was probably going to be booted here. Like her continuing to talk about her wanting to distance herself from Bruce, how Bruce is dragging down her game. All that just for Bruce to win immunity, and what she talks about whether she could be collateral damage. And all this was pretty bad. And then once she was presented as an option versus Jake, someone who is clearly meant to be the sympathetic underdog, I felt like it became pretty apparent that this was going to be a Kelly boot here. And overall, I found Kelly to be a mostly competent player. She pretty much fulfilled what I expected from her in the preseason, where she was going to be this mostly level-headed player. A lot of her content during the season was very strategic, and while that's good to a degree, I found her personal content to be very lacking, which eventually culminated in me getting off the Kelly train, where I saw her as just being another big player, sort of similar to what I said about Caleb earlier in the season. So obviously that was a factor, and I do think she gets a little unlucky by the fact that Bruce loses his vote at this tribal, where through that, it made it harder for the Bells to get the numbers, it made it harder for them to get Emily on their side, and obviously that leads to them being taken out here. And I felt a little bad for her too when she did get voted out. You can clearly tell that she was just gutted when she saw all the votes coming in for her. So I do feel a little bad for her to that degree. You can tell that she very much wanted it. But obviously she is out of the game now, which is why she's here at number 10.
And before we continue, I just wanted to give a quick shout out to Russell Muscle TV, who I'm partnering up with this season to promote Idle Plays. Idle Plays is an online shop where you can purchase Survivor puzzles so you can practice them and be just like Carson from Survivor 44. We got all different selections here, including the fire puzzle, the snake to the top puzzle, the 5-piece puzzle that Spencer solved in 5 seconds from Survivor Cambodia, and more. If you want to take home Survivor puzzles made by superfans for superfans, feel free to click the link in the description and start shopping now.
And with that, there are 9 players left in the game to talk about, and as usual, I'll be ranking them based on how likely I think they are to win based off their edit and current game position. By number 9, the person I believe is the least likely to win Survivor 45 from this point is still Bruce. And again, I feel like this was just more bad content for Bruce. Obviously, from a pure gain standpoint, this is not good, where he is the main target coming into it. He loses his vote during the auction, only for him to eventually win immunity here. All that's pretty bad. And even outside of that, he himself is not getting a lot of content to explain himself, where he is being presented as this big target, someone that even people that he trusts in Kelly are getting fed up with him, but he's not even getting to weigh in on all this. His only confessional in this episode comes at the beginning, where he's talking about how Jake put his emotions first by sticking with Caleb at the split tribal, which obviously doesn't speak well to his overall chances. And again, I feel like the edit is just doing him no favors here, where despite him being on the outs, I just don't really see how he wins the game. Now, obviously, he's probably not going to be the next boot, or at least one would think, considering he still has his idol, though you never know. But even if he does manage to survive a couple more rounds, I just don't see how he actually wins the game with the edit he's been getting, which is why he's here at number 9. Now moving on to number 8, and we have someone who is actually remaining in the same spot as last week, though I feel like my view of them has continued to go downhill, and here we have Austin. And at this point, I think Austin has a lower chance of winning than Julie, which is definitely saying something, where he literally gets no content in this episode, which is pretty bad on its own, especially with the fact that it's his own alliance that is driving this vote here to take out Kelly. And obviously, taking out Kelly is very beneficial for Austin's game, as it obviously strengthens his amulet to a full-fledged idol, which, considering the amount of content he's gotten across the season about all his various advantages, also his content about getting revenge on the people that took away his sandwich, you'd think he'd be getting a say here, but he doesn't. And to me, that's probably a major red flag for his chances moving forward, to where it just doesn't feel like he's much of a priority in the edit at this point. And I feel like with Julie getting a more consistent edit at this point, I just can't justify putting Austin above her anymore, which is why he is here at number 8. Now moving on to number 7, and we have another player remaining in the same spot as last week. But again, I just have no faith in them to actually win the game at this point. And here we have Kendra. And again, Kendra did get more content than Austin here, but a lot of it felt kind of bad. We're obviously early on just getting this content, establishing this women's alliance that had really no backing beforehand. It really doesn't stick at all during this episode. Like she's talking about how the women need to work together, which is kind of ridiculous considering the gay dynamics there. But then we get to the auction where she finally gets her personal content. She gets her intro package, talking about her meeting her biological father and that getting that beer during the auction reminded her of him. And to me, the fact that we're just getting this now, seemingly out of the blue, probably indicates she's probably won the next few boots. I actually think based off this and the current game dynamics, she's probably the next to go, if I had to guess, based off what we're seeing. And it would make sense for her to go here, given how inconsistent her edit has been, and the fact that we're just getting this content now. It sort of feels like a farewell to Kendra in a lot of ways, and it wouldn't shock me if come next week, we're talking about her being the next boot. So obviously that's pretty bad, and even outside of that, I just don't really see how she wins based off her edit, which is why she's here at number 7. Now moving on to number 6, and we have someone who I mentioned not too long ago, and here we have Julie. And I did finally decide to move Julie up, not because I think she's more likely to win now, but simply because other people have moved down. And again, she is one of the more consistent presences across the season, where she has managed to get at least one confessional in every episode. But even then, I've always criticized her for not having much of a storyline with her edit, and that feels like she's just getting content just to be present, which I feel like is pretty bad. And even in this episode, her content's pretty bad, where she's mad at Jake for voting for her at the split tribal, and she says that there's no way she works with Jake moving forward, only for her to vote to keep Jake by the end of the episode, which I found pretty funny, but also a pretty bad knock against her edit-wise. I think it's still a little up in the air over where she's actually going to place by the end of all this, where I could see her being a 0 vote finalist, I could see her going out in fire making, I could see her going out in 5th. I do think she is probably getting towards the end of the game, but I don't really see how she wins the game at this point based off her edit, which is why she's here at number 6. Now moving on to number 5, and we have a player who I've pretty much been out on for a little bit now, and I'm still out on them, and here we have Katura. And I think a really hard thing with Katura is the amount of screen time she's gotten with her rivalry with Bruce, especially considering now how long Bruce has actually been in the game. Where I feel like before I could have potentially excused it with Bruce seeming like he could have been like an early merge boot or someone taken out not too far into the game. But now that Bruce is guaranteed a spot in the final 9 and realistically a spot in the final 8 as well with his idol, the fact that this has been her primary storyline at the expense of everything else is probably a knock at this point, and I find it harder to justify Katura being a true winner contender at this point. But again, I feel like compared to all the other options, she at least has a bit more going on. And again, there is still a slight chance that things could turn around if Bruce is taken out relatively soon. She could possibly be seen as the person that is spearheading the movement to take out Bruce, someone who has been this prevalent force across the season. But again, given the fact that this has been the bulk of her content with how long Bruce has actually been in the game at this point, I don't really see any reason to have her higher than number 5. Now moving on to number 4, and I thought this was a good episode for this person, even though it doesn't really move the needle in terms of their winning chances, and here we have Drew. And again, I felt that this was a good episode for Drew. He obviously gets to reestablish his relationship with Emily. The fact that they voted together at that last tribal is pretty good. Talks about not wanting to give Bruce symbolic victories, which I found pretty funny. But obviously, the big thing to point to is that he is the one that gets the credit for flipping the vote onto Kelly, which I found to be pretty good for his edit, especially when someone like an Austin easily could have taken that spot with his storyline and with him standing to benefit the most from that move, which I found to be pretty good. I will say the one minor knock to Drew's edit here is that this was actually the last round where he could use his safety without power, and the fact that that doesn't even get mentioned here is a bit of a knock, but all things considered, I still found this to be a pretty good episode for Drew. The reason he's not higher is that I just don't think he's winning the game based off everything I said in my previous videos, in the fact that I feel like the top three are so clearly the top contenders at this point, which is why I have him here at number 4. Now moving on to number 3, and obviously it's the same top 3 as last week, and it's just a matter of ordering them. And I did debate this to a degree, and I'm still not entirely sure what to make of this person, but at number 3, I did decide to go with Jake. And obviously, Jake is very much the underdog at this point. He's very much getting that style of edit. And we got a lot of his perspective here, where obviously he talks about what happened last Tribal, how it was too much to expect Katura to go to Rocks to save Caleb, and that he shouldn't have voted Julie there, and that he was reckless. But he still wants to play Survivor. He wants to stop sucking at it. And obviously later on, like we see him like not wanting to throw out a name. He thinks that he's being baited here. He thinks the other players are not playing their own game, which then results in him using his shot in the dark at this tribal to where he's unsuccessful, but he still ends up staying due to the vote flipping onto Kelly, which by itself is very bad considering that he wasn't even included on this plan to keep him in the game, though supposedly from exit interviews he was seemingly on Kelly's side for a lot of it, where Kelly was trying to get him to not use a shot in the dark so that they could potentially have some numbers to flip over Emily and potentially take out D. But still, the fact that Jake was going to be the target here, the vote still flipped onto him by the people that he seemed to be working with at that point is pretty bad on its own. I also question whether he can actually win a jury vote at this point, where for one, he was very blatantly let out of this plan, which I think will probably be used against him if he gets to the end. Probably speaks to how people in the game perceive him. I also got a really weird vibe during the immunity challenge where, for whatever reason, Jeff kept reminding him to not bend his arm, which, again, I may be reading too much into that, but I think also speaks to the perception that someone like a Jake could give off as well. You also have the fact that he is talking a lot about playing real Survivor, which the show is probably propping up, but is also something that the players may not necessarily agree with. And there are definitely some similarities too between Jake and the likes of Owen from 43 or Carolyn from 44. These players that want to play the game aggressively, but are either not taken seriously or just extremely ineffective in the game. And I do worry that if Jake continues down this path, that he could just end up being another one of those figures where he probably gets to the end, but probably doesn't have much of a resume to prop themselves up, or just doesn't have the respect to garner many jury votes. So I think those are all very realistic concerns about Jake at this point. But I still feel like the edit is propping him up to a degree. I feel like the edit could have gone so much more negative in his direction, but he's still being shown as a pretty sympathetic figure. He's probably someone that's going to be around for a while, considering he's meant to be this underdog figure. And there's still a chance that he could turn it around by the end of it. But I feel like at this point, I probably have a bit more faith in the top 2 players than Jake to actually win the game. And even from an edit perspective, I think there's still some things there, which is why he is here, number 3. Now moving on to number 2, and I did debate these top 2 to a degree. I feel like it was a bit close considering how this week played out. But number 2, I did decide to give the edge to one person, and then I decided to drop D here to number 2. And I think it simply comes down to the fact that she got no confessionals in this episode, which I found very strange, especially considering that this is the point in the game where her alliance is seemingly taking control of the game, where obviously the Rebas are coming together, they pull in Emily, and through that they are able to get the majority here. They're able to essentially be in a spot to where they can run the game now. And I feel like moving forward, they're going to be in a very solid spot moving forward. So the fact that D doesn't get much to say here is probably not the greatest sign in the world. Now, at the end of the day, it's still not the biggest knock. I feel like there are definitely other players they can knock more for something like this. People like in Austin, for instance. But still, I found it a bit strange that she didn't get much content here. Now, granted, something else worth highlighting is the fact that she could have been a target at one point where Kelly did talk about wanting to target D, but wasn't able to do so due to her not getting Jake to not use a shot in the dark. And even then, they probably would not be able to flip Emily, which would have been necessary there. So I do also question that to a degree from a pure gain standpoint, but I would say them not highlighting that is probably a positive, though I wanted to at least mention it. And then you also have the theory that I posited last week about Reba potentially being the villains of the season and that the underdogs will eventually come out on top. And I don't think this episode did much to advance that theory, where even though it highlighted Jake being at the bottom and fighting for his life, I mean, we don't really see the Rebas being presented in that negative of a light in this episode. In fact, they're even the ones to flip the vote to keep Jake in the game. So I think for now, the jury is still out over whether the Rebas will actually come out on top by the end of it, which I think for the time being still works out in Dee's favor. So we'll obviously have to see what happens there. But still, I think I still am going to knock D one spot simply due to the fact that she got 0 confessionals this episode, which is why she's here at number 2. And now, at number 1, the person I believe is the most likely to win Survivor 45 right now is Emily. And I mainly went with this because D got 0 confessionals in this episode, where Emily herself, like, obviously got a bit more content talking about how on paper the Women's Alliance sounds good, but she obviously has the Rebas to work with. And through that, she ends up leaking the Women's Alliance to Drew, even though I don't think the Women's Alliance was really much of a thing outside of taking out Bruce. But through that, it makes it clear that Emily is planning to work with the Rebas moving forward, which by itself feels a little strange considering they were the ones to just take out Caleb, who was one of her closest allies there. Though considering that Emily had already talked about in the previous episode that she was fine letting Caleb go, considering the whole Star in the Dark play and the fact that she had already voted for him during that round, I don't really hold that too much against them. And plus, we already had some setup to Emily working with Austin and Drew moving forward. So again, I think it's pretty clear where she is going within the game at this point. I still think she is one of the top contenders, and I don't think there's really much you can knock her down for, aside from her not really getting more visibility, considering how much she got in the pre-merge. But I still think Emily is a top contender, where if we are going back to my theory over whether or not the Rebas are presented as the heroes of the season, I think Emily benefits regardless of whether they are the heroes or not. Where if they are the ones that will come out on top, she is shown to be a member within that. And through that, if Reba dominates, she can still be in the spot to win the game at the end, maybe take out Dee and Drew, the leaders of that, and come out on top by the end. Or if Rebas are the villains, she can still potentially work with Jake down the line and through that flip the game on them by the end of it. So I still think Emily's in an interesting spot to where narratively she can have her cake and eat it too. So I think that's something to consider. And I think with her edit being more consistent than D here, I did decide to put her here at number 1. And there we go. That will do it for this week's video. If you like this content, be sure to like and subscribe. Really helps out with the channel. And I'll be back again next week to update the power rankings again, so you can stay tuned for that. Now that Big Brother 25 is done, I am still doing coverage of The Amazing Race 35 as well as Survivor UK, so you can expect weekly power rankings of those shows. I am now on Patreon, so if you want to consider supporting the channel, you can do so by clicking the link in the description, and you can also join the Discord server by also clicking the link in the description. There's a lot of stuff coming your way, but for now, that is the video. See ya.